The presentation had gone well. The numbers were strong. The technology was, by every measurable standard, revolutionary, and none of it mattered, because Raymond Voss, the oldest and most influential investor at the table, had just pushed his reading glasses down his nose, folded his hands, and said the 7 words that made the entire room drop 10 degrees. Prove it works, or we're all out. Silas didn't move, didn't blink. On the outside, he was granite, composed, unreadable, the kind of calm that takes years of boardroom warfare to manufacture. But on the inside, his mind was running at full speed, because he knew exactly what Raymond meant, and he knew exactly what it would cost him. Aura, his life's work, 5 years, hundreds of millions of dollars, a matchmaking AI so sophisticated, it could analyze 847 data points about a human being and predict their perfect partner with an accuracy that made every dating app on the market look like a coin flip. He hadn't just built a product, he had built a revolution, and these 12 people in their tailored suits wanted him to test it on himself. You want me to, Silas started, input your own data. Raymond said simply, let the machine find your match, pursue that match, and if it works, he gestured around the table, we stay. Every single one of us. Someone shifted in their seat. Another investor, a sharp-faced woman named Priscilla, leaned forward with the energy of someone who had already made up her mind 3 days ago and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. And if you won't do it, Priscilla said, her voice like a paper cut, then we have serious questions about whether you actually believe in what you've built, Silas. Because a man who won't trust his own creation. I trust it, Silas said, quietly, dangerously quietly. Then prove it, Raymond said again. The room held its breath. Now here's the thing about Silas Thorne that you need to understand before this story goes any further. He wasn't the kind of man who made decisions emotionally. He was 34 years old, 6'2", with the kind of sharp angular jaw and deep-set dark eyes that made photographers want to follow him into rooms uninvited. His hair was always slightly unkempt in that specific way that looks effortless but actually costs $150 at a very quiet barbershop in Pacific Heights. He moved through the world with a precision that made most people feel slightly disorganized just by standing near him. But underneath all of that, underneath the billion-dollar company and the controlled voice and the perfectly structured worldview, Silas Thorne was a man who had been quietly, methodically, and very thoroughly afraid of love for a very long time. He'd watched his parents' marriage collapse when he was 11. Watched his father, a warm and generous man, get completely dismantled by heartbreak. Watched him make irrational decision after irrational decision, driven purely by emotion, until there was almost nothing left of the man Silas had looked up to. That was the moment young Silas decided, with the iron certainty that only a wounded child can manufacture, that emotion was the enemy. That if you could just remove the unpredictability, if you could calculate love the way you calculated everything else, nobody would ever have to hurt like that again. Aura wasn't just a business to him, it was his answer to the most painful question of his childhood. And now 12 people in a boardroom were asking him to bet it all on the very thing he'd spent his entire adult life trying to control. He looked at the screen at the far end of the room where Aura's interface glowed a soft, patient blue, waiting, always waiting, and something moved behind his eyes, something that looked almost like fear. He pulled his laptop toward him, opened the interface, and with 12 pairs of eyes burning into the back of his skull, Silas Thorne typed in his own name, uploaded his own psychological profile, his behavioral data, his communication patterns, his values, his history, and everything the machine needed to find the one person on Earth it believed he belonged with. He hit enter. The room was so silent you could hear the cursor blink. Aura processed. The little blue ring on the screen rotated once, twice, 3 times, and then the result appeared with the quiet, indifferent confidence of a machine that has absolutely no idea what kind of chaos it is about to cause. 99.9% compatibility. Silas stared at the name on the screen. Read it once, read it twice. Felt something cold crawl up the back of his neck. He turned the laptop slowly toward the room so the investors could see. Raymond leaned in, squinted at the screen, and raised both eyebrows. Nobody said anything for a very long time. Because the woman Aura had just chosen as the perfect match for the most powerful tech billionaire in San Francisco was the same woman who had been trying to expose and destroy his company for the last 2 years. Chloe Evans. Silas didn't sleep that night. He sat in his penthouse apartment on the 42nd floor with a glass of water he never drank, and the city glittering 30 feet below him like a circuit board, and he read everything there was to read about Chloe Evans. She was 29, a senior investigative journalist at the Chronicle. Originally from a small town in Oregon, Medford specifically, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody and nobody has any patience for people who think they're better than they are. She'd put herself through journalism school on a combination of scholarships, waitressing shifts, and what her college professor had apparently described in a recommendation letter as a truly alarming level of stubbornness. She had broken 4 major stories in the last 3 years. 2 of them had resulted in federal investigations. One had won her a regional press award that she'd apparently used as a doorstop, according to a colleague quoted in a profile piece from 2 years ago. She didn't do this for trophies. She did it because she genuinely, ferociously believed that powerful people should be held accountable, and she had absolutely zero interest in being charming about it. She was also, and Silas noted this with the detached analytical awareness of a man trying very hard not to notice, extraordinarily striking. There was a photo from a journalism conference in her file, candid, caught mid-laugh, dark auburn hair spilling over one shoulder, warm brown eyes creased at the corners, a dimple on her left cheek that appeared and disappeared like punctuation. She looked like someone who smiled with her whole face when something actually earned it. Silas closed the file. He opened it again 30 seconds later. Then he closed his laptop entirely, stood up, walked to the window, and stood there looking at the city for a long time with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, doing the thing he always did when a problem resisted being solved, which was to break it down into its component parts and examine each one separately until the solution revealed itself. Component 1. He needed to prove Aura worked in a real, documented, public-facing relationship within 6 months or lose his investors. Component 2. The woman the algorithm had selected for him was actively investigating his company for illegal data mining, a claim that was not, for the record, remotely true, but one that Chloe Evans had been building a very compelling circumstantial case for regardless. Component 3. If he pursued her and she found out why, if this ever looked like a calculated move to neutralize a threat, it wouldn't just end his company. It would confirm every single thing she'd ever written about him. And Component 4, the one he kept circling back to and then deliberately setting aside, the algorithm was never wrong. In 4,000 test cases, it had never once been wrong. He stood at that window until the city started going gray at the edges with early morning light, and then he made a decision that was either the smartest or the most catastrophically stupid thing he had ever done. He was going to find Chloe Evans. He was going to be completely honest with her, and he was going to make her a deal. He found her 3 days later. His team had tracked her schedule, ethically, through publicly available information. He was very specific about that with Damien, his head of engineering, who gave him a look that suggested he found the distinction somewhat academic. And she had a standing Tuesday morning habit of working from a coffee shop called Anchor and Ground on Fillmore Street. Apparently she liked the corner booth, the oat milk lattes, and the fact that the owner played jazz at a volume that was loud enough to drown out the street noise but quiet enough not to interrupt her thoughts. Silas walked in at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning in November, wearing a charcoal jacket over a black shirt, no tie, because he'd spent 11 minutes that morning deciding whether a tie made him look like he was trying too hard, and had concluded that yes, it did. The coffee shop was warm and smelled like roasted beans and cinnamon, and jazz was playing softly from somewhere near the counter. He spotted her immediately. Corner booth, laptop open, one hand wrapped around a coffee cup, the other moving a pen across a notepad with the quick, decisive strokes of someone whose thoughts move faster than their handwriting. She was wearing a worn caramel-colored leather jacket over a cream sweater, dark auburn hair pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping around her face. There was a small crease between her brows that suggested she was either deeply focused or deeply irritated, and somehow both seemed equally likely. She was also, Silas observed, with the clinical neutrality of a man who was absolutely not affected by this in any way, even more striking in person than in photographs. He walked over, stopped at the edge of her table. She didn't look up for a full 5 seconds. Not because she hadn't noticed him, he realized, but because she was finishing her sentence first. That small detail told him more about her than the entire file had. Then she looked up. Their eyes met, and for exactly 1/2 second, one brief, unguarded, completely honest half-second, something moved across her face that had nothing to do with recognition. Something warm and startled, and entirely involuntary. Then she recognized him, and the warmth evaporated like water on a hot pan. "You," she said, not a question, not a greeting. A verdict. "Me," Silas agreed, and sat down across from her like he'd been invited. "We need to talk, Miss Evans." She stared at him with the focused, measuring energy of someone deciding whether to call security or hear him out. Then she slowly closed her laptop, set down her pen, folded her hands on the table, and looked at him with brown eyes that were sharp enough to cut glass. "You have exactly 2 minutes, she said. "I suggest you use them well." Silas leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and looked at her with the same calm, direct energy he brought to every negotiation that actually mattered to him. "My AI matched us," he said. 99.9%. Highest score in the system's history. Chloe blinked. Once, the only crack in her composure. Your investors want proof it works, he continued. They want to see me in a real, documented relationship with my match within 6 months, or they pull funding. Every cent. That sounds like a problem, Chloe said pleasantly. It is, Silas said. Which is why I'm offering you something in exchange for making it a shared one. She went very still. That stillness, he would later learn, was what Chloe Evans looked like when she was actually interested in something but refused to show it too quickly. I'm listening, she said carefully. Unrestricted access, Silas said. Every server, every file, every internal communication going back 4 years. You get everything you've been trying to find for 2 years, handed to you, legitimately, with full cooperation. 6 months of access in exchange for 6 months of playing the role. The coffee shop hummed and swayed gently around them. Jazz drifted over from the counter. Outside, the city went about its Tuesday morning completely unaware that 2 people were sitting in a corner booth negotiating something that was either a brilliant arrangement or the beginning of an absolute disaster. Chloe picked up her coffee, took a slow sip, set it down. You'd give me access to everything, she said, knowing I'm looking for proof of data violations. Yes. Because you think I won't find anything. Because I know you won't find anything on me, Silas said. And the way he said it, not arrogant, not defensive, just steady and certain, made something flicker behind her eyes. She looked at him for a long moment, really looked at him the way journalists look at people when they're trying to figure out where the lie is buried. 6 months, she said finally. 6 months, he confirmed. Another long pause. Then Chloe Evans picked up her pen, uncapped it, and wrote something on the corner of her notepad. She tore it off and slid it across the table. It was her personal number. Have your lawyers call my lawyer by Thursday, she said. And Thorne, she picked up her laptop and tucked it under her arm, sliding out of the booth with the easy composure of someone who had just won a negotiation she'd walked into blind. If I find one thing that looks even slightly like you're controlling what I see, the deal is off, and I publish everything I have. Are we clear? Perfectly, Silas said. She gave him one last measuring look. Then she walked out of the coffee shop, leather jacket swaying. Without looking back, Silas sat in the corner booth for a moment, looked down at the slip of paper with her number on it. Then he looked out the window and watched her disappear into the Tuesday morning crowd. The machine had given her a 99.9% score. For the first time in 5 years, Silas Thorne wasn't entirely sure the machine was calculating the right thing. The contract was signed by Friday. Damien, who had been Silas's head of engineering and closest thing to a friend for 6 years, sat across from him in the office the following Monday morning with an expression that could only be described as professionally horrified. Let me just confirm, Damien said slowly, that you have voluntarily given the journalist who is actively trying to destroy us unrestricted access to our servers. Yes, Silas said, not looking up from his screen. And in exchange, she is pretending to date you. Correct, Silas. Damien waited until his boss looked up. I say this with genuine respect and 4 years of loyalty. This is the single most unhinged thing you have ever done. The algorithm matched us at 99.9%, Silas said simply. Damien opened his mouth and closed it, looked at the ceiling briefly, as though asking it for help. The algorithm, he said carefully, also once matched a retired accountant from Marin County with a competitive cage fighter from Fresno, and they have been happily married for 3 years, so I am not saying the algorithm is wrong. I am saying that this specific situation has a number of additional variables that— I know what I'm doing, Silas said, cutting him off. Damien looked at him for a long moment, with the quiet, complicated expression of someone who cares about a person too much to agree with them. Okay, he said finally. Okay, but I want it noted, formally, that I had concerns. Noted, Silas said. What neither of them knew. What Silas couldn't have known, sitting in that office with his controlled composure and his faith in his algorithm, was that somewhere on the other side of the city, Chloe Evans was sitting at her desk at the Chronicle, staring at her signed contract, and having a version of the exact same conversation with her editor. Except her editor, a compact, fast-talking man named Garrett, was considerably less restrained than Damien. You're doing what? Garrett said, at a volume that made 2 colleagues look up from their desks. I'm embedded, Chloe said calmly. Full access, 6 months. This is the story, Garrett. This is the one. You're pretending to be his girlfriend. I am a journalist with legitimate contractual access to a private company's internal infrastructure, Chloe said. The personal arrangement is irrelevant. Garrett stared at her. The personal arrangement is you fake dating a billionaire who thinks you're his soulmate because a computer said so. 99.9%, Chloe said, and then immediately wished she hadn't said it quite like that, because something in her voice when she said it made Garrett's eyes narrow in the specific way they did when he sensed a story within a story. "Chloe," he said carefully, "you're not going to—" "I'm not going to what, Garrett?" Her voice came out sharper than she intended. He held up both hands. "Just stay objective." "That's all I'm saying. I am always objective," Chloe said firmly, and turned back to her screen with the decisive energy of a woman who was absolutely, 100% completely in control of the situation. She opened Silas Thorne's file, read through it again from the top, and tried very hard not to think about the way he had looked at her in that coffee shop. Not with the entitled confidence she'd expected from a man worth $3 billion, but with something that looked almost uncomfortably like honesty. She closed the file. She opened it again. Stay objective, she told herself. She had absolutely no idea how much that resolution was about to cost her. Hey, my people, if this story has already got your pulse going, and trust me, we are barely even getting started, please hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Seriously, we want to know how far this story is traveling. Are you watching from Lagos, London, Los Angeles? Let us know down below. Because what's coming next? Chloe walked into Thorne Technologies for the first time. The moment she realizes the man she came to expose might not be who she thought he was. And the secret buried so deep inside that company that when it surfaces, it is going to change everything. Now let's get back to it. Because Chloe Evans just walked through the doors of the lion's den, and she had absolutely no idea the lion was watching. The first day Chloe walked into Thorne Technologies, she wore her armor. That was the only way to describe it. Dark blazer, sharp-cut trousers, recorder in her bag, notepad in her hand, and the specific expression she reserved for situations where she needed people to understand immediately that she was not someone to be handled. She'd done her prep. She knew the floor plan, the org chart, the names of the key executives, the location of the server room she most wanted access to. She was ready. What she was not ready for was the building itself. Thorne Technologies occupied 14 floors of a glass tower in Soma, and the interior looked nothing like what she'd imagined. She had expected the cold, aggressive aesthetic of a company with something to hide. All sharp edges and security checkpoints and the faint anxiety that lived in the walls of places where people are being watched. Instead, the lobby was warm, natural wood, living plant walls, actual daylight flooding in from a glass ceiling 3 stories up. The employees she passed in the hallway looked, and this irritated her slightly, genuinely happy to be there. People laughing in a glass-walled meeting room. A cluster of engineers eating lunch together on a terrace, gesturing animatedly at something on a laptop screen. It didn't look like a corrupt company. It looked like a place somebody had built with real care. She found Silas on the 8th floor, standing at a standing desk in a glass-walled office, sleeves rolled up, frowning at a line of code on a screen with the focused, slightly impatient energy of a man who thinks in a language most people can't read. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. Something passed between them again, that brief, inconvenient current she'd felt in the coffee shop, and then both of them simultaneously and deliberately set it aside, like two people agreeing without words to leave a door closed. "Miss Evans," he said, "I'll have Damien show you to your workspace." "I'd prefer to start with the server logs from 2021, she said. A pause. Then, "I'll have Damien show you to your workspace first." She held his gaze for exactly long enough to establish that this was not him managing her. Then she nodded once and followed Damien down the hall. She spent the first 2 weeks buried in data. Server logs, access records, data transfer histories. She went through everything with the systematic, unhurried thoroughness that had made her reputation. Not rushing, not jumping to conclusions, just building the picture 1 pixel at a time. And the picture that was building was not the one she had come here expecting to find. The data violations she had spent 2 years documenting, the unauthorized transfers, the third-party data sharing that shouldn't have existed, the privacy breaches affecting thousands of users. They were all real. She hadn't been wrong about that. But the deeper she went into the architecture of what had happened, the more a different shape began to emerge from the noise. The violations weren't systemic. They weren't policy. They were concentrated. Specific servers, specific time windows, specific access credentials that appeared in the logs like fingerprints. Someone inside this company had been running a shadow operation. And the access patterns told a story about who had the clearance, the motive, and the technical knowledge to pull it off. The name that kept appearing at the edges of that story was not Silas Thorne. It was his chief operating officer, a man named Dorian Vance. Meanwhile, the fake relationship had to look real. That was the part neither of them had fully thought through when they'd signed the contract in the abstract safety of legal language and professional distance. A documented relationship meant public appearances, events, The kind of carefully orchestrated visibility that would satisfy both the investors watching Silas and the colleagues watching Chloe. Their first public outing was a tech industry dinner at a rooftop venue in the financial district on a Thursday evening in late November. Silas arrived first, as he always did everywhere, and was standing near the bar when Chloe walked in. And he went very still in the specific way that people go still when they see something that surprises them without warning. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress, simple in cut but rich in color, her auburn hair down around her shoulders, and she moved through the room with the easy, unself-conscious confidence of a woman who had never once in her life walked into a room and wondered if she belonged there. She spotted him, made her way over, stood beside him and said quietly, without looking at him, "You're staring." "I'm noting," Silas said, with the same composure he used for everything. "There's a difference." She glanced at him sideways, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. "How do you want to play this?" she asked. "Naturally," he said. "Just be yourself." "Myself thinks you're probably hiding something," she said. "Then be a slightly more diplomatic version of yourself," he said, and something in his voice was so dry and so unexpectedly funny that Chloe actually laughed. A real laugh, quick and genuine, before she could stop it. She pressed her lips together, looked away. He looked at the side of her face, and for just a moment, in the warm light of that rooftop with the city spread out below them, Silas Thorne felt something shift in the carefully maintained architecture of his interior world. Something small, something he couldn't immediately quantify. He didn't like it. He also, if he was being honest with himself, and Silas was always, sometimes painfully honest with himself, didn't entirely want it to stop. But what neither of them saw, what they couldn't see from where they were standing, wrapped up in their careful arrangement and their guarded feelings, was that on the other side of that rooftop, holding a glass of champagne and watching them with cold, calculating eyes, was Dorian Vance. And Dorian Vance had just recognized Chloe Evans, and the expression on his face was not surprise. It was the quiet, dangerous focus of a man who has just identified a threat and started thinking about how to eliminate it. There is a particular kind of danger that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't kick down doors or send warnings. It moves quietly, in the background, rearranging things you can't see yet, shifting files, closing corridors, making sure that by the time you realize something is wrong, you are already standing in the middle of it with no clear way out. Chloe Evans had spent 8 years as an investigative journalist, and she had developed a very specific instinct for that kind of danger. It lived somewhere between her shoulder blades, a low, persistent tension that appeared whenever a story started pushing back. Whenever the evidence got too clean, whenever sources went quiet, a little too suddenly, that tension showed up on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of December, when she arrived at her workspace on the 8th floor of Thorne Technologies, opened the server access portal that Silas had given her full credentials for, and found that 17 files she had flagged and bookmarked the previous afternoon were gone. Not moved. Not archived. Gone. She sat very still for a moment, staring at the empty directory folders where those files had lived. Then she opened her notepad, wrote down every file name she could remember from yesterday. She had a good memory, a journalist's memory, the kind trained to retain details that other people's eyes slide right past, and started cross-referencing against the access logs to figure out who had touched those folders and when. The deletion timestamps all read 11:47 p.m. She pulled up the access credentials attached to that timestamp. The username was a generic system maintenance ID, the kind of ID that, on the surface, looks like an automated cleanup process. The kind that, if you didn't know what you were looking at, you would scroll right past without a second thought. But Chloe knew what she was looking at. And what she was looking at was a person. A real, deliberate, careful person who had waited until nearly midnight, logged in under a cover identity, and surgically removed exactly the files that were most relevant to her investigation. Whoever had done this had known what she was looking at, which meant whoever had done this had been watching her. She closed the access log, leaned back in her chair, looked at the ceiling for a moment with the quiet, focused expression she wore when a story shifted from interesting to serious. Then she picked up her phone and sent Silas a message. "We need to talk. Not in the office." He met her that evening at a small Italian restaurant in Noe Valley that he apparently went to often enough that the owner greeted him by name and led them to a corner table without being asked. It was the kind of place that had been there for 30 years. Red checked tablecloths, candles and wine bottles, the smell of garlic and rosemary living permanently in the walls, and it felt so completely unlike Silas Thorne's sleek, data-driven world that Chloe found herself momentarily disarmed by it. "You come here a lot?" she asked, settling into her chair and looking around. My mother used to bring me here, he said, opening his menu with the casual ease of a man who already knows what he's going to order. When I was a kid, she liked the tagliatelle. He said it simply, without fanfare, the way people mention things that are quietly important to them. Chloe looked at him for a fraction of a second longer than she meant to, storing the detail away, not in her journalist notepad, but somewhere else. Somewhere less professional. She refocused. Someone deleted files from my access folder last night, she said. 17 files. All flagged by me. All gone by midnight. Silas set his menu down. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind his eyes sharpened in a way she was beginning to recognize. The specific quality of his attention when something confirmed a suspicion he'd been carrying quietly. "Which files?" he asked. She slid her notepad across the table. He read through the list she'd reconstructed from memory, and the longer he read, the more a particular stillness settled into him. The kind of stillness that isn't calm, but is the thing that very controlled people put on top of something that is not calm at all. "The 2021 data transfer logs," he said quietly. "The third-party API connection records. The user authentication overrides from Q3. All pointing in the same direction," Chloe said. "All connecting to the same access pattern. And now it's all gone." Silas looked up from the notepad. Looked at her directly. "I didn't delete those files," he said. "I know," she said. That landed between them differently than either of them expected, because it wasn't something she had to say. She could have kept that conclusion to herself, held it close, used it tactically. The fact that she said it plainly, without strategy, made something shift almost imperceptibly in the air between them. "You know," he repeated. "The credential trail doesn't match your access pattern," she said in a brisk, professional tone that was doing a lot of heavy lifting. "You log in from a registered device every time. Clean timestamps. Consistent behavior. Whoever deleted those files used a ghost ID and logged in from an unregistered terminal at 11:47 at night. That's not how you operate. You've been studying how I operate," he said. "I've been studying everything," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "That's the job." A pause. The candle between them flickered. Somewhere across the restaurant, a couple laughed at something. "It's Dorian Vance," she said. Silas didn't answer immediately. He picked up his water glass, took a slow sip, set it down. But his jaw had tightened in a way that told her everything she needed to know about whether this name was a surprise to him. "What makes you say that?" he asked carefully. "Because his access credentials appear in the architecture of every single anomaly I've found so far," Chloe said. "Not directly. He's careful. He routes through intermediaries. But the pattern is consistent. Same time windows, same server clusters, same methodology every time. And he has the technical knowledge, the clearance level, and," she paused, "based on what I've read about his compensation dispute with the board 2 years ago, a motive." Silas was quiet for a long moment. The restaurant moved warmly around them, indifferent to the weight of what was sitting on their table. "I've suspected Vance for 14 months, he said finally. "I've been trying to build a case quietly enough that he doesn't know I'm looking. Because if he realizes I'm close, he'll destroy the evidence, and I'll have nothing." Chloe stared at him. 14 months. "Yes. You've known for over a year that someone inside your company was running illegal data operations, and you've been building an airtight case," he said, and his voice carried a firmness that wasn't defensiveness. It was conviction. "Because I am not going to rush this and lose it. I am not going to give him a technicality. When this goes to prosecutors, it goes with everything. Every thread. Every proof. No gaps." Chloe sat back in her chair. She looked at him. Really looked at him, with the evaluating, penetrating focus that she usually reserved for subjects she was trying to catch in a lie. But the thing was, she wasn't finding a lie. She was finding something that looked, inconveniently and unmistakably, like integrity. "You built Aura," she said slowly, thinking out loud in a way she rarely let herself do in front of a subject. "A company worth $3 billion. And you've spent 14 months quietly trying to protect the people whose data was violated, rather than just cutting Vance loose and saving your own reputation. Those are real people," Silas said simply. "Their data is their privacy. Their lives. I'm not protecting my reputation. I'm trying to protect them." The candle flickered again. Chloe picked up her fork, put it back down, did the thing she almost never did, which was to take a breath and admit to herself, privately and uncomfortably, that she might have been wrong about someone. Not wrong about the story. The violations were real. The harm was real. But wrong about the villain. She had walked into Thorn Technologies 2 weeks ago, absolutely certain of what she was going to find. And the story that was actually here was so much more complicated and so much more interesting than the one she'd come looking for. "I need you to let me keep digging," she said. and I need you to trust me with what you already have on Vance." "That's a significant task," Silas said. "I know," she said. But here's the thing, Silas. It was the first time she'd used his first name. Neither of them mentioned it, but both of them noticed. Two sets of eyes are better than one, and I have skills you don't. I know how to construct a public record from this kind of evidence. I know what prosecutors need. I know what editors need. I know how to tell this story in a way that cannot be ignored and cannot be buried." He looked at her for a long, measuring moment across the candlelight. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and slid a small, encrypted drive across the tablecloth. 14 months of work, he said quietly. "Everything I have." Chloe looked at the drive, then at him, then she picked it up and closed her hand around it. "Thank you," she said. It was a small thing to say, but it felt enormous. December moved into January, and something else was moving too. Something neither of them had budgeted for in their carefully constructed arrangement. The fake relationship had been designed to have the appearance of warmth without the substance of it. Carefully staged appearances, coordinated public moments, a shared narrative maintained at a professional distance. That was the agreement. That was the plan. The plan was encountering some significant implementation problems. It started with small things. The way Silas, despite being a man who measured everything, had started making sure there was an oat milk latte on Chloe's desk every morning without being asked. Because he'd noticed on day 3 that she always went to get one at 9, and he walked past the kitchen anyway. He never mentioned it. She never thanked him directly. But she started finding them there, and she stopped going to the kitchen at 9. And neither of them acknowledged this quiet little system they'd built. It continued with the Tuesday evening when Chloe had stayed late working on the Vance files, and Silas had found her asleep at her desk at 11 p.m. with her jacket over her shoulders, half-finished notes spread out in front of her, pen still loosely in her hand. He had stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he very quietly ordered food from the Thai place 2 blocks away, set it on the corner of her desk, turned off the overhead light so only the warm lamp remained, and went back to his office. She found the food when she woke up 20 minutes later. She looked at it, looked at his closed office door, and sat with a feeling she didn't immediately have a category for. And it continued, most significantly, with a Sunday afternoon in late January, when the investor documentation required them to spend the day together doing something that looked, photographically, like a couple being naturally happy in the world. Damien, who had taken on the role of reluctant logistics coordinator for the entire arrangement with the long-suffering energy of a man who had accepted his fate, had suggested a farmer's market in the ferry building, public enough to be seen, relaxed enough to look genuine. What he had not anticipated, what nobody had anticipated, was that Silas Thorne, let loose in a farmer's market on a Sunday morning with no agenda and no meeting to get to, turned out to be a completely different person from the man who existed in boardrooms and offices. He stopped at a honey vendor and spent 7 minutes asking genuinely curious questions about the different regional varieties. He bought a ridiculous quantity of heirloom tomatoes because, as he explained with complete seriousness, they were architecturally interesting. He got into a friendly disagreement with a cheese vendor about the merits of a specific aged manchego, and the disagreement was so amiable and so unexpectedly charming that the vendor ended up giving him an extra sample and telling him to come back next week. Chloe walked beside him through all of this with her recorder off, her notepad in her bag, and an expression on her face that she was deeply grateful nobody was photographing, because it was soft in a way she couldn't entirely control, and soft was not something she could afford to be. "You're different outside the office," she said at one point. "Am I?" he said. "Not quite a question. In the office you're—" she searched for the right word. "Compressed, like you're running 17 processes simultaneously and keeping most of them internal." He considered this. "That's an accurate description. Out here you're just—" she gestured vaguely at him and the tomatoes and the honey vendor. "A person." Something moved in his expression. Something quiet and complicated. "I used to come to this market with my father," he said, "before everything fell apart. He used to say the only honest thing about a city was its food markets, because nobody could fake what they actually wanted to eat." He said it lightly, but it landed with weight because Chloe had by now read enough about Silas Thorne's childhood, had put together enough fragments from interviews and profiles, and the quiet architecture of how he talked about the past, to understand what those Sunday markets represented. A version of his life that had existed before the fracture. Before the grief of watching love destroy the person he'd admired most. She thought about the machine he'd built. About 847 data points and compatibility scores, and the clinical, beautiful, heartbreaking attempt to make love into something that couldn't hurt anyone. She thought about the boy who had watched his father fall apart and decided, at 11 years old, that he would find a better way. And something in her chest did a slow, complicated movement that had absolutely nothing to do with journalism. Now here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean the specific kind of interesting, where you want to grab your protagonist by the shoulders and say, "Girl, woman, ma'am, do you see what is happening right now?" Because Chloe Evans, sharp and seasoned and completely clear-eyed about the world, was falling for Silas Thorne. Not the billionaire, not the subject, not the man she'd spent 2 years building a case against. The actual person, the one who bought architecturally interesting tomatoes and remembered exactly how his father talked about food markets and had spent 14 quiet, unacknowledged months trying to protect strangers whose data had been stolen. She knew it the way you know things you don't want to know. Slowly at first, then all at once, like a tide coming in that you keep telling yourself you'll step back from, and then suddenly you're standing in it up to your waist. And on the other side of this, because this story is never simple, and the universe has a very specific sense of humor, Silas Thorne was having his own private reckoning. He had built Aura on the premise that love was a calculation. That compatibility was a function of aligned data points and complementary behavioral patterns. That if you removed the chaos and the irrationality and the terrifying unpredictability of human emotion, you could arrive at a partnership that was stable and sustainable and safe. And then Chloe Evans had walked into his building with her leather jacket and her sharp eyes and her absolute refusal to be managed, and she had proceeded to be the single most uncalculable person he had ever encountered in his life. She didn't behave according to pattern. She made intuitive leaps that shouldn't have worked and then turned out to be exactly right. She challenged him on things he'd stopped questioning years ago. Not aggressively, but with a genuine probing curiosity that forced him to actually defend his positions rather than just inhabit them. She made him laugh. Really laugh. Not the polite social version, in ways he hadn't seen coming. He ran the data points in his head, repeatedly, looking for the formula that explained what was happening, the variable he could isolate and examine. He couldn't find it. And for a man who had built his entire life on the belief that everything could be understood if you just looked at it carefully enough, that was more unsettling than anything he'd experienced in a boardroom. The algorithm had given her 99.9%. He was beginning to understand, with a slow and somewhat terrifying clarity, that the algorithm hadn't been calculating compatibility. It had been recognizing something. Hey, if you're watching this and you're screaming at your screen right now because these two obviously belong together, and they are both being extremely stubborn about it, you are not alone. Drop a comment below, Team Silas or Team Chloe. And while you're there, hit subscribe and like the video because what happened next is going to absolutely wreck you in the best possible way. We need you to subscribe so you don't miss it. Now let's get back to the story. Because while Silas and Chloe were busy falling for each other and pretending very hard not to be, Dorian Vance had been doing something far more dangerous than deleting files. He'd been watching. Dorian Vance was 51 years old, with silver-streaked hair, a face that had been handsome once and had curdled slightly into something more calculating, and the particular brand of intelligence that expresses itself primarily as contempt for everyone less clever than you, which, in Dorian's estimation, was essentially everyone. He had been with Thorne Technologies for 6 years. He had watched Silas build the company from a promising startup into a billion-dollar enterprise, had contributed meaningfully to its early growth, and had spent the last 3 years watching himself receive a fraction of the credit and compensation he believed he deserved. The board liked Silas. The press liked Silas. The algorithm was Silas's vision, and Silas's name, and Silas's face on every magazine cover. Dorian had decided, approximately 2 years ago, that if Silas wasn't going to compensate him fairly, then he would compensate himself through other means. The data operation he'd constructed was elegant. Small enough to avoid detection, lucrative enough to matter, routed through enough intermediary channels to be effectively invisible to anyone who wasn't looking very specifically and very carefully. He had not anticipated that anyone would look very specifically and very carefully. He had especially not anticipated Chloe Evans. He'd recognized her 3 weeks ago at the investor dinner, had done his own research the moment he got home that night, and what he'd found had made the temperature in his chest drop several degrees. A journalist. An investigative journalist. The investigative journalist who had already spent 2 years building a public case against Thorne Technologies. And she was here, inside the building, with full access, under a cover story about a relationship that Dorian did not believe for 1 single second was genuine. He'd started monitoring her access patterns immediately, had deleted the most dangerous files when he realized how close she was getting, had started very quietly, very carefully constructing a response. Because Dorian Vance was many things, but he was not someone who went down without taking everyone in the vicinity down with him. He picked up his phone and made a call to a contact at a gossip and tech news site. The kind of site that asked no questions about sources and published first and verified never. "I have a story for you," he said, when the contact answered. A journalist infiltrating a private company under the cover of a fake relationship, using access she obtained through personal manipulation to dig for a hit piece. corporate espionage dressed up as romance. A pause on the other end. Then, "How soon can you get me documentation?" "Give me a week," Dorian said. He hung up, sat back, and looked out his office window at the city below with the quiet, satisfied expression of a man who has just moved a piece on a board that nobody else can see yet. One floor down, in a warm office with a half-finished latte on the desk and 14 months of encrypted evidence spread across her screen, Chloe Evans was building something that was going to end him. She just didn't know yet that he was already building something back. The evening it shifted. The evening, the invisible line between them finally stopped existing, was unremarkable in its setup and irreversible in its consequences. It was a Tuesday night in early February. Chloe had been at her desk for 11 hours, cross-referencing Dorian's transaction records with the encrypted files Silas had given her, and she had finally found the thread that connected everything. The piece that transformed 14 months of suggestive evidence into a clear, prosecutable, incontrovertible pattern. She sat back in her chair and let out a long, slow breath. Then she picked up her phone and called Silas. He answered on the second ring. "I found it," she said. A pause. "Say that again." "I found the connection," she said. "All of it. The full chain from the initial data extraction to the third-party sale to the account it was deposited into. It's all there, Silas. Every link. It's airtight." The silence on the other end of the phone lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then, "Don't move." He was in her office in 6 minutes, which meant he had been in the building. He crossed the room and leaned over her shoulder to look at her screen, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and for a long moment they both just looked at it. The full architecture of Dorian Vance's betrayal laid out in data and timestamps and transaction records, irrefutable and complete. "There it is," Silas said quietly. "There it is," Chloe agreed. He straightened and turned to look at her. She too turned to look at him, and they were close, closer than they usually allowed themselves to be, and neither of them moved away. "You did this," he said. Not with surprise, exactly. More like recognition. "We did this," she said, and something moved across his face, something she'd never seen there before. Not in the boardroom, not in the restaurant, not in any of the carefully managed interactions that had preceded this moment. It was open, unguarded, the face of a man who has, without quite planning it, let someone in. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face. A gesture so quiet and so natural, it seemed to surprise both of them. And then his hand rested against her jaw for just a moment, and she didn't move away. And the space between them closed in the specific, irreversible way that spaces close, when two people have been standing on opposite sides of a line for a very long time, and one of them finally steps across it. They kissed. It was not dramatic. There was no soundtrack. The office was quiet around them, screens glowing softly, the city dark outside the windows. But it was, and this is the only honest word for it, real. The kind of real that doesn't ask permission and doesn't leave room for arguing about it afterward. When they pulled back, Chloe looked at him with an expression that was equal parts warmth and terror. "This wasn't in the contract," she said. "No," he agreed. He was looking at her in a way that made her want to look away, and she didn't. "Silas, I know," he said quietly. "I know what this is. I'm not pretending otherwise." She searched his face, found nothing but honesty looking back at her. And Chloe Evans, who had built a career on healthy skepticism and the refusal to believe things without evidence, found herself with more evidence than she could argue with. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay," he said. And for one quiet, perfect, terrifyingly fragile moment, it was. Neither of them saw what was already in motion. Neither of them knew that across the city, in a glass office with the lights dimmed, Dorian Vance had just sent a package of documents to 3 separate news outlets. Documents that told a very specific, very damaging story about a journalist named Chloe Evans, a fake relationship, and a corporate infiltration designed to bring down Thorn Technologies from the inside. And neither of them knew that Chloe's editor, Garrett, had seen a preview of that story hit his inbox at 11:53 p.m. and had immediately opened a new email to Chloe with the subject line reading, in capital letters, "Publish the piece. Tomorrow. OR, you're done." The evidence was found. The truth was in their hands. And the fire had just been set to everything around them. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in the moments just before everything falls apart. Not the comfortable silence of two people who have run out of things to say. Not the peaceful silence of a city settling into sleep. This is the silence of a held breath, of a structure still standing while the foundation underneath it has already given way. Of two people lying in the warmth of something new and fragile, completely unaware that on the other side of the city someone has already lit the match. Chloe drove home that Tuesday night with her hands steady on the wheel and her mind doing anything but. The encrypted drive sat in her bag. The evidence was complete. The story she had spent 2 years chasing was finally, fully, undeniably hers, and it was a better story than the one she'd come looking for. Not a takedown of a corrupt billionaire. Something more complex and more true. The story of a rogue executive, a cover-up, and a man trying quietly and at great personal cost to make it right. She pulled into her parking spot, sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, and touched her fingers to her lips. Okay, she told herself. You are a professional. You are in control of this. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was an email from Garrett, subject line in full capitals, the way Garrett only wrote when he was either furious or frightened, and right now she strongly suspected both. Publish the piece. Tomorrow. OR, you're done. She read the email 3 times in the dark of her car, each pass making the knot in her stomach pull tighter. Garrett had seen a preview. That was clear from the body of the email. Terse, clipped, written in the staccato rhythm of a man typing faster than he was thinking. Someone had sent him a package. Documentation, he said. Proof that Chloe had entered into a personal relationship with her subject under false pretenses. Proof that she had used emotional manipulation to gain access to proprietary information. Proof, as the package apparently framed it, that Chloe Evans wasn't an investigative journalist at all but a corporate spy using the oldest tool in the playbook. The word tomorrow sat on the screen like a deadline and a threat wearing the same clothes. She knew immediately who had sent it. She knew the shape of it. The timing, the targeting, the surgical precision of striking at exactly the moment when she was closest to the truth. Dorian Vance hadn't just been covering his tracks. He'd been building a counteroffensive. And while she and Silas had been in that office finding the thread that would unravel him, he had been pulling a different thread entirely. She sat in the car for another few minutes. Then she went upstairs, made coffee she didn't drink, and opened her laptop. She had a decision to make. The piece she had originally come to write, the data violations exposé, the story that had Silas Thorne's name at the center of it, the career-defining hit that Garrett had been waiting 2 years for her to deliver. That version of the story was still possible. She had enough for it. Not the full truth, not the exonerating truth, but enough circumstantial architecture to build a compelling and damaging narrative that the public would consume, and that would generate exactly the kind of industry earthquake that made careers. She could publish that tomorrow. Keep her job, protect her professional standing, neutralize Dorian's leak by getting out ahead of it, and in doing so she would burn Silas Thorne to the ground for a crime he didn't commit, while the man who actually committed it watched from a safe distance and congratulated himself on his own cleverness. She stared at her screen. Then she opened a new document, put her hands on the keyboard, and started writing a completely different story. Silas found out on a Thursday morning. He arrived at the office at 7:45, as he always did, stopped to look at the morning data summaries his system generated overnight, and noticed a flag on his media monitoring feed. His name, multiple outlets. The same story, circulating in preview form through the kind of back-channel industry networks that meant a publication was imminent. He read it standing up. Didn't sit down. Didn't make coffee. Just stood at his desk and read it, with the particular stillness of a man absorbing a blow he is refusing to react to until he has understood it completely. The story was about Chloe. Not about the data violations. Not about Dorian. About Chloe. Her original assignment, her 2-year investigation, the pitch she had made to Garrett before she ever walked into Thorne Technologies. The package framed everything with a precision that was almost admirable in its malice. The fake relationship as a Trojan horse, the access agreement as corporate infiltration, the personal dimension as calculated seduction, designed to compromise his judgment and access his company's most sensitive information. It made her sound like a weapon that had been aimed at him from the beginning. He read it twice, set his phone down, walked to the window. The city spread out below him in the early morning gray, indifferent and enormous. And Silas Thorne stood very still in front of it and did something he almost never did. He let himself feel it, not the professional implications. Those were a separate problem, a solvable problem, a problem for later. He let himself feel the specific, particular weight of this. The warmth of Tuesday night. The evidence spread across her screen. Her hand in his. We did this. The way she'd said his name in the Italian restaurant when she'd been thinking out loud and forgotten, briefly, to be guarded. The farmer's market and the latte on her desk, and every small, accumulated, unremarkable moment that it built, without him noticing it happening, and then suddenly completely impossible to deny, into something he had not felt since he was a child, watching his father love someone and thinking, I want that, and I am terrified of it. He had let someone in. He had done the one thing he had designed an entire company to help other people do safely, and he had done it without any of the protections he'd spent 5 years building. And now he was standing at the window of his 42nd floor office feeling exactly the thing he had spent his entire adult life engineering a solution against. He was heartbroken. He picked up his phone, called his head of legal, told them, in a calm and level voice, to begin preparing for an emergency board meeting and a CEO transition statement. Then he called Damien. "I need you to revoke Chloe Evans's building access," he said. A long pause on the other end. "Silas." "Please," he said. Just that one word, and something in it. Some quality of it that Damien had never heard in Silas's voice in 6 years made Damien go quiet. "Done," Damien said softly. Silas hung up, looked at the window, looked at his own reflection in it. Composed, unreadable, held together as always by the discipline of a man who learned very young that falling apart was a luxury he couldn't afford. The algorithm had given her 99.9%. He thought, with a distant and almost clinical bitterness. Even the machine got it wrong in the end. Chloe arrived at the building at 8:15 to find her key card declined. She tried it twice, looked at the reader, tried it a third time. Then she stood on the pavement outside the glass doors of Thorn Technologies in the February morning cold, with her bag over her shoulder and the laptop containing 70 hours of work and everything she needed to finish the story she was writing. The right story, the true story, inside it, and understood immediately what had happened. He'd seen the preview. He knew. She pulled out her phone and called his number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She stood there for a moment. People moved past her on the pavement, morning commuters with coffees and headphones, completely unbothered by the specific quiet devastation of a woman standing outside a locked building understanding, for the first time, the full cost of her original choices. She had come here to get a story. That was true. She had made a deal that served her interests, and that she had walked into with the calculated professionalism of a journalist who knew exactly what she was doing. She had told herself it was clean, transactional, contained, and somewhere between the server logs in the Italian restaurant and the farmer's market, and a Tuesday evening in a quiet office when the evidence finally aligned and he had looked at her like she was the most real thing in the room, it had become something else entirely, something she hadn't budgeted for and couldn't have argued her way out of even if she'd tried. She had hurt him, not because she'd lied exactly. The terms of their arrangement had been explicit and mutual, but because she had never, at any point in the early weeks, considered the possibility that she would stop being objective. She had never thought there was a risk of her becoming the person who needed to protect him. She had walked in as the journalist, and somewhere along the way had become something the contract had no language for. She owed him the truth. The full truth. Not the version she could hide behind professional boundaries, but the actual thing. That she had started out with a story and ended up with something she hadn't known she needed. But right now, she also owed him something more urgent than an explanation. She owed him the evidence that would save him. She sat down on the low wall outside the building, opened her laptop in the February cold, and kept writing. The board meeting happened at 10 a.m. 12 faces around a table. Some of them the same investors who had sat in this room 3 months ago and demanded Silas prove his algorithm worked. And all of them wearing the careful, uncomfortable expressions of people who have received bad news and are trying to project authority while they process it. Silas stood at the head of the table and laid it out with the clean, direct honesty that was his most consistent quality. The media story about Chloe, the access agreement, the original investigation. He did not minimize it or spin it, or construct a narrative that was kinder to him than the facts warranted. He told them what had happened, including the parts that reflected poorly on his judgment, because the alternative was to be the kind of person he had never wanted to be. Raymond Voss sat at the far end of the table with his hands folded and his expression unreadable. "The company's position is untenable if this goes public the wrong way," Priscilla said. "The stock will." "I know what the stock will do," Silas said calmly, "which is why I'm recommending a transition of leadership. Effective immediately." The room erupted in a low, overlapping wave of protest and concern, and the kind of urgent, fragmented discussion that happens when a room full of very powerful people suddenly realizes a situation is moving faster than they can manage. Silas let it run for about 45 seconds. Then he said quietly, "I want to be clear about something before this goes any further." The room settled. "Whatever my personal failings in judgment over the last 3 months," he said, "the data violations that have driven this entire situation were not mine. I have known for 14 months that Dorian Vance was operating an unauthorized data monetization scheme through our servers. I have been building a case against him, quietly, because I needed it to be airtight. And the evidence I have. Silas, Dorian said from 3 seats down, his voice perfectly measured. I don't think this is the time to... The evidence I have, Silas continued, as though Dorian had not spoken, is comprehensive, and it is in the hands of someone who knows exactly what to do with it. He looked at Dorian when he said that last part. Just for a moment. Dorian's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The first crack in the composure. The first sign of a man recalculating. Raymond Voss leaned forward slowly. What exactly are you saying, Silas? He asked. I'm saying, Silas said, that before anyone in this room makes any permanent decisions, you might want to wait approximately. He checked his watch. 40 minutes. He hadn't actually known what Chloe was going to do. He wanted to be honest about that, with himself at least, because the truth was that he had stood at that window that morning and felt the heartbreak, and made the decision to revoke her access and prepare to step down. And at no point had he felt certain about what the woman he'd fallen for was going to choose when everything came down to it. He didn't know if she would publish the original hit piece and save her career. He didn't know if she would stay silent and walk away and let the whole thing collapse under its own weight. He didn't know if she would choose the story or choose him, and he had told himself, very firmly standing at that window, that he wasn't going to factor himself into her equation, that she had to make this decision freely, without the weight of what existed between them distorting it. He had said in the board meeting to wait 40 minutes because he believed, not knew, but believed, with the specific quality of belief that lives right next to fear, that Chloe Evans was the kind of person who, when she found out the full truth about something, could not bring herself to tell any version of it except the right one. He believed that because it was the thing he most recognized in her, the thing that was most like him. The 40 minutes passed. The boardroom was very quiet. And then Damien appeared in the doorway with his phone in his hand and an expression on his face that Silas had never seen there before. Something wide open and slightly stunned, like a man watching something he didn't expect to be beautiful, turn out to be exactly that. It's live, Damien said. The story hit every major platform at 11:17 a.m. on a Thursday in February. The byline read Chloe Evans, The Chronicle. The headline read, The Man Inside the Machine. How Thorn Technologies' COO Dorian Vance ran a shadow data operation for 2 years, and how Silas Thorn spent 14 months trying to stop him. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary piece of journalism. Not because it was dramatic, though it was. Not because it was comprehensive, though it was that too. Every claim triple-sourced, every transaction documented, every thread of Dorian's operation laid out with the methodical, unassailable clarity of someone who had spent weeks inside the evidence and knew every corner of it. It was extraordinary because of what it chose to be. It wasn't a hit piece. It wasn't a takedown. It was the truth. The full, complicated, uncomfortable, exonerating truth, told with the precision of a journalist and the conviction of someone who had decided, at some point between the server logs and the Tuesday evening in a quiet office, that the truth mattered more than the story she'd originally wanted to tell. It named Dorian Vance. It documented everything. It included copies of the evidence Silas had spent 14 months assembling, combined with the additional threads Chloe had uncovered through her own investigation. It was, as 3 separate legal analysts would describe it within the hour, exactly the kind of airtight, prosecutable public record that makes prosecutors pick up their phones. And in the final 3 paragraphs, the ones that made Silas stop breathing for a moment when he read them, Chloe did something she had never done in 8 years of journalism. She wrote about herself, not personally, not confessionally, but with a journalistic honesty that was, in its own way, more vulnerable than either of those things. She disclosed the access agreement. She described the terms of it, the arrangement, the 6 months, the quid pro quo, not to justify herself, but to be transparent about the conditions under which her investigation had taken place. She disclosed that over the course of the investigation, her professional relationship with the subject had evolved into something personal. She disclosed that this created a conflict of interest that a reader deserved to know about. And then she said that none of it had changed what the evidence showed, that the truth was the truth regardless of who found it or what it cost them to tell it. Journalism is not the story you set out to find, she wrote in the last paragraph. It is the story that is actually there. This is that story. Silas read it on his phone, standing in the corridor outside the boardroom. He read it twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and walked back into the boardroom, where 12 investors and one very pale Dorian Vance were sitting in various states of emergency. I'll be withdrawing my resignation, Silas said quietly. Dorian Vance's lawyer called at noon to begin negotiating a cooperation agreement with federal investigators, which was the legal equivalent of someone realizing their building is on fire and deciding to stop arguing about who left the stove on. By 2 p.m., 3 federal agencies had confirmed they were opening investigations based on the Chronicle article. By 3 p.m., Dorian had been walked out of the Thorne Technologies building by his own attorney, carrying a small personal items box and moving with the careful, diminished energy of a man who has finally been seen clearly and found entirely wanting. The board, in an emergency session that lasted 40 minutes and involved considerably less drama than the morning's version, voted unanimously to retain Silas as CEO, authorize a full external audit, and issue a public statement that used Chloe's article as its primary source document, which was, Damien observed quietly, probably not a combination of events that had ever occurred before in the history of corporate governance. Silas sat in his office afterward in the particular quiet that follows a very long and very loud day, and looked at his phone. He had one unsent message to Chloe that he had written and deleted 3 times since reading her article. Each version had been either too formal or too much, and none of them had said the actual thing, which was that she had surprised him, that she had done something he hadn't asked her to do and hadn't expected her to do, and that had cost her something real. Her original story, her straightforward career win, the version of this where she walked away unambiguously triumphant, and she had done it anyway. He had built a machine designed to eliminate surprise from love, and the most important thing that had ever happened to him had been a complete surprise. He deleted the 4th draft, put his phone down, stood up, got his jacket. He found her at Anchor and Ground. Of course he did. Corner booth, laptop open, half-finished oat milk latte. She looked up when he walked in, and her expression did the thing it always did, that half-second of unguarded warmth before the composure reassembled itself, except this time she let the warmth stay. Didn't lock it away. Just looked at him with brown eyes that were tired and honest and entirely undefended. He sat down across from her. They looked at each other for a moment. "You pulled your resignation," she said. "You didn't publish the hit piece," he said. A pause. "I published the true piece," she said. "There's a difference." "There is," he agreed. The coffee shop moved gently around them. Jazz from the counter. The smell of roasted beans. A Tuesday morning in February, except it was Thursday. And neither of them was the person they had been when they first sat across from each other in this booth. "I need to tell you something," Chloe said. "I know what you need to tell me," Silas said. "Let me say it," she said quietly. He nodded. She looked at the table for a moment. Then at him. "I came here to get a story. That was real. The original plan was real. And I thought I could keep it clean and contained and professional, and She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. "I was wrong about you. About what kind of man you were. I came in with a conclusion, and I let the evidence change my mind, which is supposed to be what I do. But it took longer than it should have because Another pause. Because being wrong about you meant being wrong about some things I'd already decided about the world. About powerful people. About whether someone like me could be worth trusting," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said simply. "Chloe," he said. And the way he said her name, just that, just her name, with a directness and an absence of performance that was so completely him, made something loosen in her chest. "You changed my mind, too." She looked at him carefully. "About what?" "About data points," he said, with the particular dry honesty she had come to understand was his version of vulnerability. "I built Aura because I believed love could be made safe if you removed enough variables, if you calculated carefully enough, if you knew enough about a person before you let them matter." "And?" she asked softly. "And you are the least calculable person I have ever met," he said. "You don't behave according to pattern. You make leaps I can't follow and land in places I didn't see coming. You challenged every position I'd stopped questioning. You made me laugh when I wasn't expecting to. You drove me absolutely insane on a near-daily basis. That's a terrible love confession," she said. But her voice had gone soft. "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." He leaned forward slightly. "The algorithm gave you 99.9%. I used to think that meant we were compatible in the ways that mattered. Values, communication, complementary thinking. And we are those things." "But?" she asked. "But that's not why," he said. "That's not why any of this happened. The algorithm found you because the algorithm is very good at identifying the shape of someone who will challenge you in exactly the ways you need to be challenged. It found someone who would make me question the thing I'd been most afraid to question." She was quiet. "I've been afraid of this," he said. "Since I was 11 years old, I have been afraid of exactly this." "And you—" He stopped. "Gather the words with the careful deliberateness of a man who doesn't say imprecise things. You walked into my building with a recorder in your bag and a case against me, and an absolute refusal to be managed. And you took apart every defense I'd built, and you did it without even trying. And I am." "Silas," she said. "Terrified," he said. "And completely certain." Both at the same time. "I don't have a data point for that." Chloe Evans, who had written 4 award-adjacent stories, survived 8 years in a cutthroat industry, argued with federal sources, walked into a billionaire's company with nothing but a press credential and a theory, and had never once in her professional life been at a loss for what to say next. Looked at this man across a red-checked tablecloth in a coffee shop that smelled like cinnamon and espresso, and felt something she had no algorithm for either. "I don't have a data point for it either," she said quietly. He looked at her. She looked at him. And then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and it was such a small gesture and such an enormous one, and the coffee shop kept moving around them as warmly and indifferently as it always had, and neither of them said anything else for a moment, because sometimes the thing that is true between two people doesn't need any more words than that. 3 weeks later, Silas stood at a podium at a Thorn Technologies press event. Not a resignation press conference, but a product launch for the updated public-facing version of Aura, rebuilt with transparent data practices and a privacy architecture that Chloe had, somewhat to everyone's amusement, consulted on extensively. He spoke about the algorithm, about what it could do and what it couldn't, about the 847 data points and the 99.9%, and the thing the machine was actually good at, which was finding people who would grow you, not people who were comfortable, but people who were right. At the end, a journalist in the front row, young, sharp-looking, with the specific energy of someone who asks the question everyone else is thinking, raised her hand. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "a lot has been made of the fact that the AI matched you with the journalist who was investigating your company. Some people are saying the whole thing was a publicity stunt. Can you tell us, did the algorithm work?" Silas paused. He was very good at pauses. "The algorithm identified someone who challenged every assumption I'd built my life around," he said. "Someone who found the truth when the truth was complicated. Someone who chose what was right over what was easy." He looked out at the room. The algorithm worked exactly as designed. What happened after that? He glanced briefly to the side of the room, where Chloe was standing against the wall with her notepad. Out of habit, probably, or just because she always had it. And she was looking at him with that expression, the warm one, the one that came and went like punctuation. "Was entirely human," he said. In the back row, a journalist who had come to cover the product launch found herself writing in her notepad. Not about the AI, not about the stock price, not about the data privacy architecture. She was writing, "The most interesting thing about a man who tried to calculate love is that when it actually happened to him, he couldn't calculate it at all. And it turned out that was the whole point." She underlined the last sentence. Then she looked up at Silas at the podium and at Chloe against the wall, and at the specific, quiet, unperformative way they occupied the same room. Not making a show of it, not playing to any camera, just two people who had been through something and come out the other side changed by it. And she thought, that's the story. Except here's the thing. Here's the part that wasn't in any press release or product launch speech or carefully worded public statement. Here's what was still unresolved, still unfinished, still sitting beneath the surface of everything like a current that the cameras couldn't see. Dorian Vance's cooperation agreement with federal investigators had revealed something. Something that his attorney had disclosed quietly, in a sealed document, that had not yet been made public. The data operation hadn't just been about money. Dorian had been selling user data, yes, but the buyer wasn't a standard third-party advertiser. The buyer was a private intelligence firm, and the data they had purchased wasn't being used for targeted ads or algorithmic marketing. It was being used to build profiles. Behavioral profiles. On specific individuals. And the list of those individuals, the names in the targeting file that federal investigators had discovered buried in Dorian's personal encrypted archive, included politicians, executives, journalists. It included, on page 7 of a 43-page document, the name Chloe Evans. Dorian had known who she was long before the investor dinner, long before she walked through the doors of Thorn Technologies, which meant the question of how she had ended up as Silas's 99.9% match. A question that had always lived quietly in the background, the kind of question that felt almost too convenient to ask out loud. That question had just become considerably more complicated. Silas found the document on a Tuesday evening. Read it alone in his office. Read page 7 twice. He sat in the dark for a long time. And then he did something that surprised even him. He didn't call his lawyers. He called Chloe. "I need to show you something," he said when she answered. A pause. "What is it?" She could hear something in his voice. Not the controlled composure, not the boardroom steadiness, but the other thing. The underneath thing. "Something that might change the way you look at all of this," he said quietly. "Or might not. I don't know yet. But I think you need to see it, Silas." Her voice was careful. You're scaring me a little. I know, he said. I'm a little scared too. Outside his window, the city glittered against the dark, vast and indifferent and full of stories that hadn't finished yet. The algorithm sat in its servers, patient and precise, processing the data of 10,000 people searching for the right person. And in a glass office on the 42nd floor of a building in Soma, a man who had built a machine to answer the hardest question in the world was sitting in the dark holding a document that had just generated a whole new set of questions. And for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't sure the machine was going to be able to answer them. Some things, it turned out, required something the data couldn't give you. The courage to keep looking. And that, my people, is where we leave them. Silas with a document that rewrites the beginning of their story. Chloe with a phone call that sounds like it could undo everything she just chose to trust. And a question sitting right in the middle of all of it. One that neither of them has the data to answer yet. Was the 99.9% match the most honest thing the algorithm ever produced? Or the most dangerous? If this story got under your skin, if you found yourself choosing sides, holding your breath, or yelling at your screen, then you already know what to do. Hit subscribe, like the video, and drop a comment telling us what you think that document means. Did Dorian plant the match? Was Chloe set up from the beginning? Or did the algorithm find something real regardless of how the data got there? Because Season 2 is coming, and the question it starts with is the one nobody has answered yet. If the match was engineered, does that make what they feel less real? Or does it make the choice they made to trust each other anyway, the most human thing of all? We'll see you there.